Hello everyone, my name is Mr. Gentleman and we are here to do one thing and one thing only, and that is discuss Final Fantasy II. Note that this will primarily, I repeat, primarily be covering the original Famicom version, though the remakes will be discussed as we go along. Final Fantasy was a decently financial success. Creator Hironobu Sakaguchi remained at Square and didn't go back to college. All seemed well with the world. Square had made a Hail Mary play, printing and shipping 400,000 copies in hope that it would become a franchise. And then it came time to make Final Fantasy II, what would become one of the most divisive games in the franchise. Anyone who knows the game has probably heard whispers of strange character building systems and imbalanced mechanics. Many despise it, some are indifferent, and there is a group of people who love the game, mostly those who play the remakes. What went wrong? Who was at the center of this? Who is responsible for such a chain of events? To start, Square was one of the earliest game companies that believed development shouldn't be done by just a few programmers. They should be crafted by a team with hierarchical organization and everyone having a specific role. As a result, Sakaguchi's title went from being head designer to being director. The rest of the game's initial team returned as well. Kenji Terada, MAZterXP, Yoshitaka Amano, and Nobuo Uematsu. Sakaguchi's fellow designers had to step up, Hiyomichi Tanaka, Koichi Ishii, and taking on a more significant designer role, Akitoshi Kawazu. Oh, and we have much to say about him. The problem creating a franchise is that if you decide you want one without a plan, it could create a few problems. At the start of Final Fantasy II's development, nobody had a single idea what the game was to be about. Completely clueless, they decided to make it unrelated to the first. But call it serendipity, this ended up being somewhat of a good thing, as this confusion was actually how every game's penchant for having a different story and setting was actually born. Isn't it strange to know that this concept came out of a bunch of creative people having no idea what to do at first? But it still didn't change the fact that this team was going into this project blind. The one thing Sakaguchi knew is that he wanted his focus to be more on story. Thus, both he and Terada focused on and wrote the narrative first, with gameplay to be built around the story. Meanwhile, Kawazu ended up with the primary role in developing gameplay. Kawazu convinced Sakaguchi to remove the class system. This began the series' penchant for changing character building systems in each game. Personally, I think that's a good thing. However, the risk with reinventing the wheel is that every time you make a game, while some may hail you as revolutionary, you also put yourself at risk of creating something that could go very wrong. Kawazu devised a new concept where stats and attributes increased with how you acted in battle. Before I go into detail, I must talk about how the hit and row systems work. The returning hit system multiplies damage by the amount of hits. How many hits you land depends on accuracy. The new row system created a back row where someone could not be hit by physical attacks. In turn, they could not attack themselves save for some exceptions. If your front row is defeated, then the back row moves up. The enemies have very similar rules that apply to them as well. Back to customization, you are given 4 main characters. Unlike Final Fantasy I and more like Dragon Quest II and Phantasy Star, these were set characters with personalities. Firion was the head of the group, looking like the first game's warrior. There's Maria, who really only wonders what happened to her brother. Then we have Guy, the gentle giant who can talk to animals. And present at first but disappearing soon after, leaving your 4th slot empty, is Maria's older brother, Leon. Your 4th spot is occupied by a revolving door of characters you meet throughout the game, all with varying specific abilities. To start, any character could equip any piece of equipment. Weapons were balanced according to the damage they could do and the accuracy they had. So axes were the strongest, but the low accuracy could mean they hit less. Whereas knives were the weakest, but potentially could gain more hits every time they were used. Bows were decent, but they could be used from the back row. Fists were excellent, but used both hands, meaning you could not use a shield. Shields increased evasion, which worked because enemies also operate on the hit system. Holding only one weapon and no shield gave a 2-handed attack bonus. Also, to do maximum damage, you had to equip the weapon in your dominant hand, which is interesting. Experience is awarded according to your weapon use. After 100 experience, your skill level rises, allowing for more hits. In the first game, your hit potential would depend on your accuracy stat. but Final Fantasy II wanted to take it and give you a kind of natural control over it. This kind of risk and reward as well as natural growth was potentially groundbreaking. Potentially. Magic works similarly. Gone are the first game's MP charges, now replaced by a more traditional system. Any character could learn any spell regardless of white or black magic, with a threshold of 16 slots. When you used a spell, it gained experience and could level up, each level adding another possible hit. Again, this system allowed for a great amount of customization. Rather than just having a set class, you could potentially craft your own build. Potentially. The way stats work is that they can rise with use. Being hit can cause HP and vitality to go up, using MP can lead to MP gains, black magic to intelligence, white magic to soul, evading to agility, and being hit by magic to magic defense. The obvious appeal is the idea of natural progression, that your stats and abilities are going up in a way that is connected to how you're actually using them. On top of that, the specific stats are being customized according to how you chose your character to act, and how you chose for them to specialize in combat. It's a system that logically makes sense and in a way was a forerunner to games like The Elder Scrolls and The Secret of Mana. The ideas gave way to growth being something that potentially felt more real to life. Potentially. Different armor have different weight. The general rule is that heavy body armor gives a ton of defense, but the weight lowers your evasion drastically. Later on, light armor shows up which adds less defense but penalizes your evasion less. You may also consider giving your evasion-based characters only an armlet or headgear, which gives limited defense but only sacrifices a small amount of evasion. At this point it's become clear that Final Fantasy II's mechanics were ahead of their time as these concepts permeate RPGs today. The combined amount of customization possibilities and risk and reward was potentially amazing. Potentially. In terms of the battle system, the side view, different sized enemies, and slot for 8 monsters all returned, though the window bars from the original game have been removed. I also like how the characters walk across the screen when they win. It's charming and gives the game its own character. Each party member have item slots to carry items or place equipment. What's neat is that you can do things like change weapons during battle, and this was the first Final Fantasy to introduce manual multi-targeting. Just hit up and you'll target all enemies for less damage. Add this with a new row system and mechanics and potentially you have a very interesting battle system. Potentially. But now, I interrupt my analysis for story time with Final Fantasy II. HCBailly was a brilliant programmer, yet there were some issues programming could not get him out of. In the middle of development, his work visa expired, forcing him to return to the US. So what did Square do? Well, they packed up, took their equipment, and went to Sacramento. I can't imagine that any of this jived well with Square's budget or production schedule. If you would believe it, this would happen again on the production of Final Fantasy III. If you didn't get it, this is a prelude to everything going downhill in this video. I have yet to talk about the man of the hour, Kawazu. Take a trip with me in my time machine. Kawazu would create the SaGa franchise. His games have a very unique feeling to them. They don't conform to the norms of popular ideas, and they always try new things. And I deeply respect that, and I respect him as an artist. But that's not the whole story. SaGa uses a lot of unique concepts present throughout the series, many of which began in Final Fantasy II. And it's also one, in my opinion, that doesn't become truly great until the 5th installment. How does it take that many chances to get something right? What kind of game is SaGa? To give a microcosm, you're all familiar with Pokemon, correct? Pokemon was a game partly inspired by SaGa's mutant classes. Now you know how you can replace bad skills with better ones. You know, a system that makes logical common sense. In SaGa, if you have too many moves, the game can randomly overwrite an old one and replace it with a new move that can be worse, or even useless without telling you. That kind of RNG and missing information is Kawazu's fingerprint. The Zodiac Spear disaster in Final Fantasy XII. Kawazu. The strange mechanics of Unlimited Saga. Kawazu. The fact the Last Remnant exists. Kawazu. It's easy to think that Final Fantasy II was not playtested, perhaps because of time or money. But in truth, the feeling the game has not been playtested and leaving the mechanics to utter randomness is partly intentional. There is no greater proof of this than that even after Final Fantasy II, some SaGa games for a long time would retain the exact same problems. And now, we truly begin. I first started by saying that stats went up with use. In reality, the system is based on RNG. As a result, your stats might rise with use. You could be there attempting to raise certain stats and be stuck with very bad rolls. At many points in the game, I felt I was never getting the necessary gains. Can MP rise already? I've already emptied my MP 3 times. I often felt like I wasn't getting back the increases in proportion to the work I put in, and dungeons were artificially made harder. What makes things far worse, however, is that your stats can randomly lower. I've even had cases where I had someone attack and use magic in the same battle and lose both strength and intelligence in the same fight. Because the game requires you to train soul for white magic so much because you need heal, cure, and life, Porphyrion, my white magic user, ends up spending most of the game with 12 strength. Your primary attackers will always be attacking, so whatever penalty they pay isn't a big deal. But your magical characters are going to suffer immensely, which is strange, considering the entire point of the game is supposed to be freer customization compared to the first. Truly strange are the starting stats. Pharyon is balanced, Guy has higher strength, and Maria has higher intelligence. If the goal is customization, then this is self-defeating. The game is essentially telling you that there is an optimal way to train your characters. Sure, you could change it up, but to what benefit? I could make Guy the healer next time, but all I'm really doing is switching places with Pharyon, as well as not taking advantage of his early starting strength. As a result, each time I play the game, it felt like the same run. Now join me on a thought experiment. Adding in random stat reduction, my strongman Guy losing intelligence made him like a warrior. Using magic lowers vitality, making Maria like a black mage, though admittedly one good with spares on my run. And try making a jack of all trades, which means stats will only be above average, and spell levels will rise lower. Which reminds me of a red mage. One of my biggest problems with the game are what I call non-decisions, where the game makes it look like it has a strong sense of choice. In this case, in actuality, it feels like you're stuck with the basic class system anyway. The entire game's crux is essentially a giant non-decision. Gaining experience for weapons takes forever, as you only get 1 or 2 experience per hit, making the process extremely slow. Everything takes so long to accomplish. Again, for pure attackers, this mostly isn't a problem, but it starts to undercut customization since the process of maintaining everything at the levels they need to be is such an ordeal. More of this on the magic side in a moment. But the game decides it wants to try to help you. How will you help me, game? With an extremely high encounter rate for dungeons and with lots of high HP enemies, turning dungeons into a long, drawn-out affair. Mid-game, this includes random encounters that are practically mini-bosses. It's less that they're hard and more that you're being thrown at them when your stat and skill levels aren't ready for them. They're basically hard-hitting meat shields to absorb your hits to raise your levels. And you are going to encounter them multiple times in a single dungeon. It becomes this excruciatingly slow slog and process. When you begin the game, all your weapon skills are 0, which means you spend your first hour or 2 missing constantly. It's not until you reach level 2 that you're guaranteed a hit, making early battles feel long and boring. I think they were going for a metaphor with how unproficient these kids are at first, but it clashes with how we naturally react when we miss, with frustration. And then there is magic. You get few points per use and you have multiple spells to raise, making getting all of your magic up to speed excruciatingly slow. And a spell not being at the right level can make it very useless very easily. And as you get more and more, there are some you have to level up. Sure, there are some optimal ways of getting around this, but you wouldn't know those unless someone told you. Because of all this, you really don't get to enjoy the huge amount of spells in the game, just maybe 6 or 7. I agree that a game forcing you to specialize and to pick and choose is a good thing. Specialization is at the heart of RPGs. But the game goes too far. Experimentation is also a huge part of RPGs, and this game discourages it. Even more annoying is that support spells can miss. You know, the spells needed to cure status ailments. These battles are long enough, and if heal isn't at a certain level, it will just say it misses. The game doesn't inform you of this, so you'll be sitting there, not realizing level 2 heal can't get rid of level 47 gonorrhea. The same goes for support defensive spells. And then there's the way you level them up. To raise something like, say, heal, you have to use it constantly in battle when it doesn't need to be used. You're not going to get 100 experience when a Ghast shoves Black Plague in your eyes. And this makes the game even slower because you're casting Life or Blink or whatever for the millionth time, artificially extending battles using support skills when you could have ended the fight 2 turns ago. But even with offensive magic, it's uncomfortable. Interchangeably using fire and physical attack to gain experience for both feels so forced and unnatural. By making spells hard to level up, I'm sure they were trying to limit how many you can make useful and force you to specialize. But as I said before, they go too far and discourage experimentation. It certainly doesn't help that every spell you get, including late game ones like Flare and Ultima, are all given to you at level 1. Once again, this creates a non-decision, where you're so busy struggling to level up what you have that when you receive new spells you'll only be able to level up 1, even if that. Again, the overall sense of customization is undermined. Further examples of non-decisions are that some spells are mandatory for every run. Because you only have time to level up 6 to 8 spells, so many of my runs look the same. So I just end up using those along with maybe 1 or 2 new ones I didn't use before. The game wants you to think it has hard decisions like choosing between heal and peep. But because of the circumstances, you're really only going to use heal. Remember how I mentioned the choice between evasion and defense? Once again, a non-decision. The problem is evasion is unequivocally better. It affects dodging overall, how many hits enemies land, running, and who attacks earlier in battle. The game is stacked in agility's corner. As a result, the game never incentivizes creating a tank. Evasion being optimal discourages fists and bows since those don't allow you to use shields which increase evasion. When one style of gameplay is far more rewarding, you undermine your entire reason for creating alternate playstyles. Additionally, with weapons, axes bottom out mid-game. There aren't even that many axe choices throughout the title. Knives weren't properly tested and are way too weak even with high hits. This makes swords, canes, and spears really the only optimal weapons in the game. One of the issues with shopping is that nothing tells you what it does. Yes, this was present in Final Fantasy I, but it was easier to figure out. But the systems here are more complex. You don't know how much evasion and armor decreases until you buy it. Customization really requires visibility. There is a difference between making a game hard and making a game hard to play. But more nefarious is what is known as the Insole Penalty. Certain armor drops intelligence and soul by 70%. You're in battle and Guy is dying from dysentery and you have no idea why heal won't work. But what makes this truly evil is that nothing tells you about the penalty. RPGs back then were all about looking at stats, and there's nothing wrong with that. The problem is the lack of visibility. When the hit system is everything, invisible stats that could cause these skills to miss is the absolute worst to have. So let's turn back to Nazaire for a moment. I don't want to sell him short. The man is a legendary programmer who retired comfortably. He lives off all of that money from the games he worked on. But you know how Final Fantasy I had a few unfortunate glitches? Final Fantasy II is even more buggy. Sakaguchi years later said that he believed these glitches came from Nazaire's unfamiliarity. But what's strange is that some of the glitches are worse than the last game. In Final Fantasy I, the fighter had a glitch where it wouldn't calculate stats properly unless you de-equipped and re-equipped his armor. In this game, that's true of everyone's evade stat. If you want their evade level ups to actually show, you have to de-equip and re-equip your armor. But it gets better. Once again, it's story time with Final Fantasy II. The Ultima spell is bugged. The way the spell is supposed to work is that its power is supposed to be based on how many things you leveled up and how high you leveled them. but the spell as it is just doesn't work properly in general. Upon learning this, Sakaguchi confronted Nazir and told him to fix it, but Nazir, in his infinite wisdom, replied with this. All of that legendary stuff, it dates back to an age that didn't even have proper techniques. If you were to look at such things now, in the present point of view, it would be natural that they look inferior. For this reason, it's a given that Ultima's abilities would be bad. As for those who struggled and ultimately acquired it only to find that it's useless, well, that's something that often happens in life. So I'm not going to fix it. Except that kind of argument doesn't work in this situation. Sakaguchi was furious. Whatever, just give me the source, he said. Nazir must have replied, sure, here you go, boss. Being a proactive man, the director sought to fix the bug himself. But when he did, what he found surprised him. It turned out that Nazir had ciphered the code. This meant that no one could fix it but him. And thus, the true mythology of the Ultima spell passes into legend. The overall problem is that this contradicts the game's lore, where Ultima was a powerful enough spell to destroy Pandemonium. If the game was not plot-heavy and left things to character imagination or left things up to interpretation, then maybe Nazir's made-up explanation could work. But this is a central part of the plot. The Mysidians built a 10th-floor tower that's guarded by a gigantic water beast that can swallow ships whole. I don't think they would have locked it away unless it was truly that strong. And considering all the legends turn out to be true and Pandemonium Rebuilt shows up, it proves Ultima did have that power. Not to mention, consider that it takes approximately 4 dungeons, what amounts to 6+ hours of gameplay to obtain the spell. And you went through all of that for something that's bugged. Seriously? What was supposed to be an example of ludonarrative cohesion ended up being a bumbling level of ludonarrative dissonance. What dark cloud was hanging over this game's production? It is possible to get through the game with minimal grinding. The optimal way involves interchanging between attacking and using a spell constantly. But like I said, it feels forced and unnatural. You're just wasting away turns to level something up, and you must do this for the entire game. On top of all of this, I don't think the level up system connects with the player. One of the things we love in RPGs is when it goes do-do-do-do-do and all of the stats go up. It makes us feel good, it feels visceral, you feel the connection between the battle, gained experience, the jingle, and the stat gains. This is a deliberate process. Yet whenever I see this flurry of stat ups, all I feel is a black hole of emptiness. I realize it's because what you did to gain that stat increase is disconnected with the statement. It would have felt more in line if you got the stat gain during battle, when that strike that you used is what increased that stat. And finally, the game has an awful final boss. First off, how did this guy become king of the underworld? I turned him into a frog. Anyway, the fight only highlights my idea that Kawazu has no idea what game design is. Bosses should test how well someone understood the game's systems. Many attacks, however, are simply useless against a boss. But the entire crux of the game is that you chose how to raise your character. You're essentially telling the player that their work has been useless. However, the Blood Sword does incredible damage. Good luck to those who have no idea how the Blood Sword even works and ended up selling it. A good final boss would have been one with 3 parts. You have to figure out which one is invincible, which ones are weak to physical damage, and which one to magic. To make things interesting, he can switch up immunities. Once you have defeated 2 parts, the last part loses all of its immunities and can be damaged by both physical and magical attacks. This would have served for a powerful catharsis for the game's gameplay. And yet, funnily enough, in other areas the game is broken. The most noteworthy is the select cancel trick. Select target, then cancel, and you gain 1 experience point for the attack or spell. Granted, this method is long and boring in its own right, but with enough patience it's highly exploitable. I have to imagine this was added to make leveling smoother, but could no one see that this was going to happen? A fun set of spells are Toad and Minnie. In fact, I consider it the most fun part of the game. If you can get them to level 6, their chances of basically turning anything into Kermit or Mini-Me skyrockets, including boss fights. And by boss fights, I mean story-based boss fights. And by story-based boss fights, I mean the Emperor, the big bad of the game. I think someone forgot the program immunity. This could have been clever if you had to level them up to 10, because then it would have been a reward for putting in so much effort. After all, you'd have given up a lot of time to train up other important spells. I admit I'm torn. During the late game, a lot of spells start becoming less effective, while battles are frequent, long, and boring. After 20 hours, I'm tired of playing this game. So while yes, they're broken, it alleviates some of the later game's long dungeons. I am also impressed at how many colored midget and frog sprites they made for the game, though. But yes, they probably should have given the bosses some kind of immunity. The game also inadvertently encourages intense levels of sadomasochism. The primary way to exploit the game is to get into battle with weak enemies and have your characters begin hitting themselves. You do this and hope that it will raise your HP, vitality, and magic defense after battle. With enough patience, you can make everyone godlike very early in the game. When asked about this, Kawazu said he included being able to hit your allies to be a way to wake people up. He totally didn't see that people would use this as a way to grind. You may ask, aren't you being a hypocrite? You see, on one hand there are all of these frustrating elements, but now you're saying it's too easy to break the game. A good RPG manages to balance its strategies out. One of the things that made the original game so enjoyable was its strategic focus. It was always challenging and never broken. This game, however, is either way too frustrating or way too easy. No matter what, nothing feels like it falls in that comfortable center. What haven't I covered? The guesswork you have to do for bosses who practically need to be beaten by a specific weapon or spell, and the fact that nothing clues you in about this. Then there's the most ridiculous limited item menu I've ever seen. But finally, I just want to emphasize one last time how slow it all is. Any one issue on its own would be forgivable, but altogether, extremely long dungeons, which I usually like, combined with slow combat, a super high encounter rate, huge packs of enemies, and the stupid gigas. Having to artificially stretch out your own battles constantly to get your magic levels up, and everything else that makes things take time just over and over and over again. Sometimes the game just pushes you to your limit. Oh, and there's Fire 8. There to slow me down once again. Whose idea was it to give enemies attacks like this? Alright, finally, we've won. Oh no. Oh no. Oh no. But there are some things I can't deny. There are some things I do like about the game. The change spell, which allows you to swap HP and MP with the enemy, is pretty cool. Aspil is pretty useful here. The game has a ton of great firsts. The first Spoony Prince, the first Dark Knight, the first Dragoon. A lot of well-known monsters receive their origin here. This is the first game to use Amano's drawings as portraits to create a feeling of immersion. The Chocobo and its theme show up here for the first time. Leviathan is pretty cool. The colored dragons appear here. The row system and manual multi-targeting are great additions that really became huge parts of the series. Apart from all of the other factors that make them long and slow, I generally enjoyed the dungeon designs themselves. I describe them as having open exploration designs. Whereas Final Fantasy I was more about branching paths while looking for the exit on the other side, this game increasingly becomes more about open floors that you have to search through, often having multiple exits that lead to very different parts of the dungeon. I like that the game is good at testing you at certain points, creating enemies that are only affected by certain elements or physical attacks, or certain things to evaluate your understanding of the mechanics. And they usually show up at really smart points in the game, such as the warship. While most of the sense of customization, as I explained, is rendered null, there are cool things like having Kirin blink on multiple characters. I love how the animations upgrade every few magic levels, giving it a real sense of progression. With all of that out of the way, let us see how Sakaguchi and Terada are doing with the narrative. After all, certainly I can trust that these two can do no wrong. we are greeted with scrolling text informing us of the dreaded Empire, whose emperor, a person who's only referred to for 2/3 of the story, and we never see in person until then, is using powers beyond normal humans to dominate the world. Against him is the rebellion who chooses to stand against his dreaded imperialism. The story starts with a cold open in the midst of combat. Then everyone dies. Anyway, you turn up alive, and according to Minwu, you have a strong life force. As you step out, airships can be seen flying above, which is a great world-building mechanism. It's really impressive for the Famicom. It lets you know that in this world there are commodities that people use like airplanes. You may even head down to the pub and talk to Sid and take a flight wherever you wish for a price. In Dragon Quest I style fashion, you can see your goal early on.
That's no
airship. That's the Empire's mighty weapon, the warship, or dreadnought in the remakes. You gain word that the man who is in charge of watching over it is the Dark Knight, a figure who quickly rose in the ranks who hides his face behind a dark mask. After helping to free the enslaved in a cave and obtaining some mithril, you search to find a way to destroy the dreadnought. As it turns out, it has a weakness in its core. The dreadnought, in a show of strength, unleashes its attack power, devastating cities and killing many. The princess and Sid are kidnapped after the dreadnought pulls in their aircraft. You rescue them and destroy the dreaded machine. The team escapes, but not before having a confrontation with a Dark Knight on a suspended metal bridge. At some point you will be pulled in for seduction by Hilda, and it turns out it's not the real princess.
It's a trap!
You must embark upon a desert region and fight for the captive princess with a monster in a locked pit. Of course you have been fooled and must make a daring escape. Of course you discover there is a natural occurring power known as the Mist, and oh, I'm sorry, I'm mixing up my references again. There is no mist in Final Fantasy II. You go on a journey to obtain the ultimate power, the Ultima spell. Little tribal beings who are out of place in a serious setting. While this is going on, the Empire strikes back with a new super weapon. One manned by the Emperor himself and is cloaked in a cyclone, a barrier making it physically unapproachable. Thanks to the last wyvern, you get on board and face the Emperor, who tells you to embrace the darkness within you and that you cannot fight it. Oh wait, I'm sorry, I did it again. There is no temptation in Final Fantasy II. Anyway, you turn the Emperor into a frog or a midget. The true identity of the Dark Knight is revealed. Maria, I am your brother. We try to take him down, but the Emperor returns. In fact, he's kind of sold his soul to the devil. Leon joins your team, and together you destroy the Emperor for good. As the game comes to an end, the hero sees his departed allies one last time before rejoining his friends. And that's the story of Final Fantasy II. The Force Awakens. To be fair, Final Fantasy II joins the RPGs of 1988 and 89 like Dragon Quest III and Phantasy Star II that were attempting to push narratives in gaming. It's often heralded for its dark narrative, which is admittedly different for its time. However, being dark alone doesn't make it good, and its contemporaries had moments that were just as dark. I think a more worthy descriptor for Final Fantasy II is that it's a heavy war story. It opens with an imperialistic campaign across the world that you get to experience by being victims of a conquered area. Desperation fills the dialogue of NPCs, the overworld music conveys a sense of dreariness, the art looks more muddy compared to the first in a good way, cities are being occupied. The entire thing gives off a sense of hopelessness. It's by far the game's strongest merit and its biggest contribution to early RPGs. In fact, if I had to say there were two people who didn't feel like they were having a messy year, it was Uematsu and Amano. Uematsu had yet to fully develop his polystylism, but his craft was really beginning to come together here. His tracks managed to give the game a very strong tone and feeling. I'm not usually a fan of Amano's art, but I actually think this work on Final Fantasy II is perhaps the best of his career. The dark lining, surreal style, and choice of color reflect characters living in a war-torn world where one has to fight to survive. Back to story, while plot-driven narratives are not my preferred style, the game deserves credit for bringing in a very structured 3-act plot with exposition, rising action, a climax, and then falling action. Objectives and dungeons are constantly driven by the advancements of the plot and feel like part of a logical set of events. Creating a story that functions in this format was still new to video games, and I give credit where credit is due. One thing the game is noted for is that it has quite a bit of death. By the end, entire city populaces are killed and you can no longer enter certain cities. Characters die and often leave behind loved ones. War is tough, it's a hard reality, and people have to deal with its consequences. The fact that the game went all the way with this is very brave. Even playable characters do die, most of which are self-sacrifices, which are meant to give the sense that they're propelling you forward, giving a feeling of I must keep going, so that I may honor their sacrifice. However, most deaths happen to the rotating door of a person in the 4th position. I kept asking myself, so when is this guy going to kick the bucket? This kind of spoils the mood since I'm more focused on which number 4 will croak rather than the game's atmosphere. One thing I will say is overrated when it comes to conversations about the game, however, is the idea of individualized characters with personalities. Really, if you think about it, they're not that much far ahead of Dragon Quest II's characters, and that was almost 2 years ago at this point. Compare this game to Phantasy Star, where everyone had a strong motivation. They all felt like they had a purpose in that world. In this regard, I still consider Final Fantasy II to be behind its contemporaries. There is quite a bit of changing dialogue, which is impressive, but simultaneously there is also a rampant amount of laziness as well. Fynn is overtaken by the Empire, so if you confront the Knights, they will attack you, and the town has random encounters. Towns are designed with more variety compared to the last title, giving the sense of a larger world. Of course, you do have to fill in the blanks sometimes. You obtain the Mithril? You're now high-ranking resistant members that answer to the king. The coward Prince Gordon completed one mission? Let's make him Commander-in-Chief. One feature that I am fond of is that at the end of conversations you get 3 options. Learn is used in special occasions where you can learn special passwords. Say allows you to use certain words in certain conversations. And Item allows you to ask how that character feels about a certain item. These kind of dialogue expanding options were really good and again ahead of their time. It makes it feel like you're having an actual interactive conversation with people. In fact, my favorite part of the game is this bookcase in Mysidia. Yes, a bookcase. You can use this system to present all of your passwords to it and get interesting lore about everything. I'd like more games where I can do this, where I can present an item to someone and get a reaction out of them. That said, I never felt like it was used to its fullest potential, and it almost always felt used in a basic, by-the-numbers fashion, where you simply present the right password or item. What if you could do this with more NPCs and not just important characters and unlock different conversations? Earn different items, earn secrets, or special hints. The game's most complete failure, however, is in its pacing. The early game was a slog with you having to backtrack over the same areas with the same weak level 1 enemies. Sure, you could use the airship, but money is sensitive early on. However, the bigger issue is the second half of the game. Now, RPGs tend to have a certain sense of pacing where you gain some story and tension begins. You cross the field, low tension, go through a dungeon where the tension builds and continues to do so until the tension peaks, sometimes with a boss fight. Then you make your way through the field, which is the cooldown period. And then you get another cutscene, which is both the rest and the resetting of this cycle as it begins to build tension in a new plot point. You don't always have to follow this, but in plot-focused stories it's usually a good idea. The story primes you for the dungeon crawling. When you have to do a larger quest, the game usually primes you for this by creating a greater sense of urgency, creating a psychological preparation for longer, tougher dungeons. The second half of this game, however, especially during the Ultima quest, is absolutely grueling as you have to do a chain of sailing and dungeons with no real cooldown or rest. You just feel like you're doing these long, boring dungeons one after the other, one after the other, one after the other. It's slow, tiring, exhausting, and boring, and is by far one of the most damaging elements of the game, both story and gameplay-wise. Final Fantasy II was initially only released in Japan. There were plans to bring it westward with its localized box art having been featured. A translation was underway, but only a prototype was completed before Square decided to cancel its release. This version, called Final Fantasy II Dark Shadow over Palakia, only had what could be seen as a first draft completed. Amusingly, years later, this cart would show up on eBay and sell for $55,000. It later had its ROM dumped onto the internet. A few minor cosmetic changes were included in the prototype to fit Nintendo's religious policy at the time. The decision to end localization came due to the fact the SNES was about to be released, and Square didn't want to bet on the slowly fading NES. Final Fantasy II Muma no Meikyu, translated meaning Nightmare's Labyrinth, was a novelization only released in Japan. Written by Terada himself and illustrated by Amano, the story is similar though simultaneously very different in plot. While certainly fleshed out, some of the details are questionable in quality, and many of the changes could be seen as taking away from the game's story. Towards the end of the Famicom's lifespan, the first two Final Fantasy games would be included together as a single package. Final Fantasy II, accompanied by its brethren, would later reappear for the WonderSwan Color, as part of Square and Bandai's efforts to promote the portable system. The updated graphics, redone art style, and updated game engine set the precedent for how the game would be presented from then on. The sprites being redone to be closer to Amano's SNES Final Fantasy style gameplay, and the produced cutscenes all gave the feeling of it being closer to a 16-bit title. My personal favorite change is how the battle animations were increasingly explosive as you leveled up, and multi-targeting attacks which were given their own fantastic look. Overall, while the game still plays like the original NES version, it at least runs smoother and faster and is much prettier. One of the best versions of the game, in my opinion, is the PlayStation release. The WonderSwan's visuals are heightened to a console-worthy degree and the sound to CD-level quality. FMV cutscenes were all the rage back then, and Final Fantasy II was not escaping this. Quite a few other details have been added, including a few more in-game scenes and an extras menu. On one hand, this version runs the best and the fastest in most places. On the other hand, there is lag between field movement and combat transitions due to CD technology. You may notice the new easy mode, where some merciful soul rebalanced the way the game functions to make it less grueling. Everything goes at a much smoother pace, and almost all of the problems, though not every one of them, dissipate here. You really feel like you're getting the most out of the game's ideas and mechanics without half the frustrating elements I mentioned. The downside, however, is that they went too far and weakened the monsters considerably, making the game way too easy at times. The game would have been just fine if they would have stopped at smoothing out the mechanics. Except the Gigas, he can stay weakened. The PlayStation versions of Final Fantasy I and II would be released together as Origins, which is how it would be localized in the West. This leads us to the Gameboy Advance and PSP versions. Final Fantasy I and II Dawn of Souls is a portable version of only the PS1's easy mode, but with certain downgrades in certain places. Even further gameplay changes, perhaps questionable at this point considering how easy the game has become, have been added. The biggest bonus is the post-game mode Soul of Rebirth. This new story features your fallen comrades who find themselves in a mysterious place after death and go on a journey to discover where they are. It's a rather entertaining story, and I admit I enjoyed it. But its biggest mark is that it demands some intense grinding. Minwu finds himself in a strange place after death and discovers other heroes who died during the game. They all believe they are in Jade, the pathway to hell. Eventually they find a mysterious palace. It turns out they are actually in the heavens, and the Emperor, whose dark and light half— Wait! Are you seriously telling me this Bufo had a light half? And he became Lord of Arubath, the Castle of the Heavens? What kind of poor security does this world's afterlife have? Anyway, it turns out the Emperor's light half is evil too, so we kill him. I like that this story was about adults, similar to Final Fantasy IV. Having a white mage as protagonist was interesting, and it was poetic how he got Ultima after dying to get it for others when he was alive. You have to defeat Ultima Weapon to get it, of course, but this is actually one of his easiest fights in all of the series. Final Fantasy II 20th Anniversary is the PSP version. Its differences from its Game Boy Advance counterpart are mostly cosmetic. However, many elements that were removed from that game are now restored. New here are the Arcane Labyrinths, 3 dungeons that include new equipment, bosses, and the ultimate goal, the Destroy spell, which is held by the guard Endymion. The Labyrinths use the keyword system in an interesting fashion, as they are used to decide which floor you will enter next, out of 45 different possible layouts. The Destroy spell deals 10,000 damage but kills your allies and leaves you with 1 HP and 0 MP. As powerful as it is, it's somewhat useless by the time you obtain it, as at this point you're probably strong enough to crush the final dungeon and the Emperor easily without it. Origins would eventually make its way onto PSN. Being digital removed the transition lag, making it a more enjoyable experience. The 20th Anniversary Edition would be available for the PSP Go and Vita PSN. Various mobile versions have been made of the game, the first including a Japanese phone port and a BlackBerry OS 4.5 version made by Bandai. It was built on Java ME, and for the most part it's a weaker version of the WonderSwan build. The 20th anniversary build would be remade for iOS and Android with major changes to both the field and battle UI. Some changes actually being more inspired by the original Famicom version than the remakes. Overall, I do like how the easy mode gives a more proportionate amount of experience. It's still far from perfect and many of my criticisms still stand, but you at least get to enjoy the stat building and skill leveling, which is the central tenet of the game. I just wish it didn't go so far with weakening the enemies. Except the Gigas. No one will ever like you, Gigas! But anyway, if you remember in Final Fantasy I, I disliked the easy mode remakes because they trivialized the game. But Final Fantasy II's remakes, while too easy, don't go as far and certain areas still remain a decent challenge. So in this case, if you want to play the game, feel free to play any game with the easy mode build. 364 days after the release of the original Final Fantasy, the newly created fanbase gladly bought the sequel. It would even eventually outsell the first game, though the series would have yet to reach its 1 million mark. Square, satisfied with Kawazu, would allow him to make his SaGa series to bring RPGs to the Game Boy. However, Square, unlike me, didn't have a time machine, so they couldn't see that in terms of sales to date, Final Fantasy II is the lowest selling mainline game of all time. It's simply been left behind. The game's defenders say this: it was different. Well, to be honest, every Final Fantasy is, for better and for worse. And I admit it's a tad more complicated than that. But to be analytically minded, being different doesn't automatically make you good. I like Final Fantasy II's system, but its poor executions make it simultaneously a game with its frustrations if you want to play normally, and is too easy to break if you're willing to exploit it. Additionally, the original can be too hard, and the PS1's easy mode and the remakes based on it, while far more tolerable, can get too easy at times. Ever since I heard about it, I actually wanted to like Final Fantasy II, but it simply was not meant to be. So, whose fault was it? Well, everyone's really. I know I put a lot of blame on Kawazu, and it is mostly his fault, but everyone did play a part. I admire his desire to create fresh new ideas, and it would work out eventually in future games, which are built off the back of the lack of polish in previous games he worked on. I mean, only time, finances, and manpower were sacrificed in the process, right? Kawazu needs someone with oversight to rein him in. Unfortunately, no one ever seems willing to do that, and as a result, many of his games feel like they're never playtested. After Final Fantasy II, from what I can tell, Sakaguchi never neglected having a major role in gameplay again, and eventually Takashi Tokita would become one of his head designers. In fact, the idea of the job system, the hallmark of Final Fantasy III, would be Sakaguchi's idea, and Tokita would develop the revolutionary ATB system. Considering the positive reputation of subsequent titles, I would say this was a move in the right direction. I hope you all enjoyed this video. If you did, please consider subscribing. If you would like to support this channel, please consider doing so on Patreon or PayPal. Thank you for watching, and God bless you all.